The university?
No, not the university.
Okay, we're streaming now.
Oh.
Okay, are we live?
Yes, we're live.
Oh, okay.
It's just loading. Just give a second. It's loading.
Okay. I'll wait for your cue, Salman.
It says meeting is now streaming live on Facebook.
Now we are.
Okay, very nice. Shall I go, Salman? You give me the green light? Okay, Nauman is nodding vigorously, so that means yes. Well, thank you all for being here. I'm not sure whether to say good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. I'm extremely glad to introduce you all to this to the second session of our Reparative Future Habib University Higher Education Post-Colonial Conference. And I will, as usual, shortly introduce the panelists and the topic at hand. My name is Massimo Ramaioli. I am the Assistant Dean for the School of Arts, Humanities and Social Sciences here at Habib University. I'm also an Assistant Professor in the Social Policy program here at Habib University. Today, the topic is repairing politics, and it is quite a tall order to address this topic in the context of the Higher Education Post-Colonial Conference. Let me briefly introduce the topic to the audience. The formation of modern nation states is deeply implicated in both colonialism and racism, accounting for some of the intractable problems of contemporary polities, both in the North and in the South. Our visionary panelists offer striking accounts of modern politics and offer reparative visions forward. Indeed, mentioning the panelists, sometimes you say our panelists do not need introduction, and for once this is true. I'm truly humbled and honored to be discussing today these topics with Professor Nandita Sharma, who teaches at the University of Hawaii. Professor Sharma is a professor in the sociology department at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Her work examines racism, nationalism, international migration, and post-colonial social relations. Dr. Sharma is active in no borders movements and those struggling for the planetary commons. She's the author of Home Economics, Nationalism, and the Making of Migrant Workers in Canada, and Home Rule, National Sovereignty, and the Separation of Natives and Migrants, which was published last year in 2020 by Duke University Press. The other esteemed guest we have today truly needs no presentation. Dr. Mahmood Mamdani, professor at Columbia University. His other professor is Herbert Lehman Professor of Government and Professor of Anthropology and of Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies at Columbia University and director of the Makerere Institute of Social Research in Kampala. He's the author of Neither Settler Nor Native, Citizen and Subject, and When Victims Become Killers. I am truly honored to be chairing this panel with such esteemed guests. And joining me will be one of the founding members of our Habib University community, somebody that for whoever has been at Habib University truly does not need any presentation, Dr. Nauman Naqvi, who's associate professor in the program of comparative humanities. And if I may, Nauman, the elan vital, the force behind Habib University post-colonial edge and critical thinking. So thank you so much, Nauman, for being here with us tonight. I would like, if my esteemed guests, our esteemed guests tonight, allow me to do so, just to share a couple of super quick reflections that I would like to share after reading your latest works, so Home Rule and Neither Settler Nor Native. And what I noticed was that it seems that you were somehow in conversation. I don't think directly, I don't think you were emailing or talking with one another, but I found so incredibly remarkable the fact that you were tackling very similar issues from quite different perspective and illuminating these issues again from angles that to the untrained eye may not be immediately apparent. And if I may quickly inform our audience here, we are confronted with a set of political institutions, a set of cultures, a set of political arrangements that seem to be incredibly ill-equipped to really amend some of the most potent and distressing issues that we have to confront, particularly issues of social justice, of international relations justice, of fair distribution of resources. And the tools that we have at hand are simply extremely blunt. Not only that, it seems to me that both of you suggest that the very tools that we have at hand are some of the very causes that maintain the status quo as we have it. Let me try and provide a couple of quick examples from your work, again, that I noticed. On the one hand, Dr. Sharma is suggesting how in what you call, Dr. Sharma, the post-colonial New World Order, we have, again, the idea that, you know, the solution to our problems and ills is the achievement of some sort of like political sovereignty. And whenever that will occur, then the world will be a rosy place for all the minorities, all the populations that still do not have that kind of political sovereignty. And you contend, well, that's not going to bring any real solution. We tried that for decades now, and that didn't work. We should, you know, take stock with that, with the kind of bleak assessment. Professor Mamdani, on the other hand, is suggesting how trying to amend issues of victimhood, for example, by thinking about the idea of criminal justice, really doesn't get to the issue that we're not talking about criminal justice, we're talking about political justice. And unless we really move beyond the idea of assessing who's the perpetrators and who is the victim, we shall not move beyond these frameworks that are bequeathed to us. I will not be the spoiler here because I don't want to give you the audience. I don't want to give the audience the idea that Professor Mamdani and Professor Sharma are just giving us this bleak picture of the current status. They actually provide what I would call a truly emancipatory vision of how our future could be looking like. And I'm like, wow, that's why we need these people around, because they actually can point towards a better future for all of us, to provide ideas that are really, in a way, in a sense, emancipatory and free. And the last comment I wanna give you is something that I actually learned very much by coming at Habib. So Nauman, you're partially responsible for this. The post-colonial theory is not about former colonies. It would be too easy if it was just like that. Post-colonial theory is something that talks about the whole planet, the whole world, whether you were a colonizer or a former colony. It is something that we need to live together in a better world. And I'm so glad that none of the authors tonight in their work mentioned the East-West dichotomy once. And it was so emancipatory to get rid of all the, clashing idea of, there is a first world and some other worlds out there. We're all living in the same world. And it is possible to read this world through the lens of post-colonial theory, which you are so masterfully contributing to. I think I spoke already too much, given the caliber of our panelists. So without further ado, I will go through strict alphabetic order. So Dr. Mamdani, the floor is yours, and thank you so much. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Ramaioli. Hello, Nauman, and pleased to meet you on screen, Dr. Nandita Sharma. Well, I'm pleasantly surprised that the subject matter of my book speaks to the subject matter of your conference. And so I'll try and provide an overview of key arguments in this book over the next half hour. This is a book about the nation state and about post-colonial modernity. The introduction opens with a discussion of the two phases of the nation state, non-liberal and liberal. The nation state was born in Iberia in 1492. Its agenda was summed up by a single slogan: one country, one people, one religion. This state project set fire to relations between majority and minorities within its boundaries, setting in motion processes of ethnic cleansing, specifically of Jews and Muslims. There followed a century of religious wars in Europe. This was the first, the non-liberal phase in the making of the nation state. The liberal solution to religious wars was reflected in the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. Two key components of the modern state were born at Westphalia: religious toleration at home and the reciprocal guarantee of sovereignty abroad. The liberal solution was put forward in John Locke's Treatise on Tolerance. Writing of England, Catholics can be tolerated if they renounce any political support of the Pope or of any power outside England. This is how Locke formulated the key tenet of the liberal theory of the nation state. The liberal notion of the nation state turned majority and minority into permanent political identities. Only the majority has sovereignty. The minority cannot participate in sovereignty. The notion of a sovereign majority alongside non-sovereign minorities was the original sin in the liberal theory of the nation state. I explore the export of the notion of different kinds of citizens, sovereign and non-sovereign, from the US to South Africa and Nazi Germany, and finally to Israel. At the same time, the book explores the construction of an epistemological project that grounded the political distinction between sovereign and non-sovereign subjects in an epistemic and legal distinction. The distinction between religious groups was further developed into a civilizational difference between races and tribes. The development is explored in some detail in the chapter on Sudan. This is a book about the United States as a founding experience in modern colonialism. The first chapter explores the Indian reservation as the site where core institutions of modern colonialism were forged. It is also a book about extreme violence as a consequence of modern nation-state building in the post-colonies. Should we think of extreme violence as the consequence of a criminal project executed by individuals, no matter how numerous, following the criminal model popularized by Nuremberg and today upheld by the ICC? Or should we think of it as a political project, a notion born of the transition from apartheid in South Africa? What can we learn from the failure of denazification and the relative success of post-apartheid South Africa? Finally, the book asks, what is transportable in the South African experience? What does South Africa have to teach us? To answer this question, the last chapter takes a fresh look, a look through South African lenses at Israel-Palestine, the most intractable political problem in the world today. In this talk, I'd like to comment on 4 issues. First, by taking the US as a case, I seek to compare the conquest of Indians and the domination of Africans, to distinguish between colonial conquest and racial domination as 2 different modern strategies of subjugation, each with a radically different consequence. Second, what is the difference between an immigrant and a settler? Third, I suggest we think of 2 different ways of thinking of political identity, one as historical and changeable, and the other as natural and permanent. To historicize identity is to see it as born of a particular form of the state, and therefore as changeable. But to see identity as natural and thus a permanent claim is to see it as a timeless expression of a trans-historical and innate cultural self. Finally, I suggest we decouple the nation and the state as we seek an alternative to the nation state. Let me begin with a discussion of American Indians and African Americans in the US. What's in a name? How should we call the pre-Columbian resident communities of the Americas? As Indian or as native? Indian is the name Columbus gave peoples of the New World. Though native is today considered a more politically correct designation, neither the US government nor the peoples they colonized accept it. The museum dedicated to pre-Columbian era in Washington, D.C. is called the National Museum of the American Native. It is not called the National Museum of the Native, it's called the National Museum of the American Indian, not the National Museum of the Native American. Why is it that the 1964 Civil Rights Act did not apply to Indians in reservations, so that a separate Indian Civil Rights Act had to be passed in 1968? To be sure, the two acts are not the same. The 1964 Act is constitutionally binding, whereas the 1968 Indian Act is not. It is only advisory. Reservation Indians are not and have never been rights-bearing citizens of the US in a constitutional sense. There were no reservations before the US. The reservation was a creation of the US. The reservation is geographically within the territory of the US, but it's a polity separate from the United States. The Europeans who came to America were not immigrants, they were settlers. What is the difference? Immigrants come to join existing polities, whether they seek equality or advantage in it. Settlers come to displace existing polities and establish their own exclusive sovereignty. Indian reservations are not part of the sovereign state we call the United States. In the words of Chief Justice John Marshall, writing in mid-19th century, reservations are, quote, domestic dependent colonies. The term Indian tribal sovereignty, another politically correct phrase, in fact masks colonial domination. Legally, reservation Indians are wards of the US Congress. Reservation authorities are overseen by a vast federal bureaucracy known as the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The BIA is no different from the colonial bureaucracy that governed any indirect rule colony in Africa. The Indian reservation was part of a two-state solution. The two-state solution, a sovereign state alongside a non-sovereign protectorate, was Lincoln's contribution in the second half of the 19th century. Lincoln claimed to provide a permanent solution for Indians who had survived the genocide. Germany, after Nuremberg, also embraced a two-state solution. Instead of reintegrating Jews as equal citizens in a single state, as part of a one-state solution in Germany, post-Nazi Germany embraced the idea of a separate state for Jews after the Holocaust. The fact is that the Nazi project may have been defeated militarily, but not politically. The two-state solution gave a longer lease on life to the Nazi political agenda. The latest version of the two-state solution is in Israel-Palestine. In contrast to South Africa, where the native population was subordinated, majority of the population in Israel was expelled outside its borders, as it had been in the US when Indians were herded into reservations. America also originated the notion of differentiated citizenship, with only some participating in sovereignty. Until 1921, Indians were nationals but not citizens. After that, Indians had to be naturalized as citizens. They had first to be purged as members of Indian polities before they could be naturalized as US citizens. Colonized Indians and African slaves represent two different experiences in the modern era. Whereas their land was forcibly taken from the Indians, African slaves were forcibly taken from the land. Indians were colonized, Africans enslaved and dominated racially. The consequences have been radically different. Reservation Indians have a different relationship to the US from that of African Americans. Racial and colonial domination are not the same, even if racial discrimination is common to both. Colonization refers to conquest of territory. The American Indian symbolized land which has been stolen. The African slave embodied captive and coerced labor. Politically, Indians were governed in a protectorate as part of a two-state solution. African slaves were racially segregated within a one-state polity and governed in thousands of separate plantation regimes. The one-state solution provided a political frame for the development of the struggle against Jim Crow and racial domination. Even if it proceeded by fits and starts, sometimes even receding, the one-state framework made possible the development of alliances. The two-state solution explains the continued isolation and colonial subjugation of the reservation Indian. We can see the big difference between the two in the US. The one-state solution has provided a political context for alliance building leading to a general emancipatory struggle. In contrast, a two-state solution has imposed isolation on an oppressed group by imposing on it a separate political home, a protectorate. Politically, a one-state solution is preferable to a two-state solution. The American model was exported to a number of places, among these South Africa, Germany, and Israel. South African settlers attained state independence in 1910. Settlers studied the North American experience on how Indians were governed. Three key elements of governance were imported to South Africa: homeland, traditional authority, and customary law. The starting fiction was that every tribe has a territorially contained homeland from time immemorial. The fiction of a homeland was actually a program to expel each tribe from the bulk of its historical lands. Second, it was claimed that every homeland has, from time immemorial again, been administered by a traditional authority, sanctioned by custom, and thus not subject to being accountable to its own people. Finally, the obligation of this traditional authority, it was said, is to enforce a customary law on the homeland. The legitimacy of custom is that it too has been there from time immemorial. This time, though, settlers insisted that custom be excised of all practices or notions that settlers considered repugnant to civilization. I will discuss the lessons of the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa after a discussion of Germany and Israel. South Africa was not the only place that learned from the US. So did Nazi Germany and Hitler. Hitler drew two lessons from the US. First, that genocide is doable and therefore thinkable. Two, that there can be a second and a third-class citizenship, as of Puerto Ricans, African Americans, and Indian citizens after 1921. Hitler appointed a committee of lawyers to study American citizenship laws. This background preparation led to the drafting of Nuremberg laws. This learning process has been documented in some detail by the historian James Q. Whitman of Yale University in his book, Hitler's American Model. Post-war denazification failed because the Allies shut their eyes to the political project that inspired and propelled Nazism. Nazism was a striving for a purified nation state, one that would go beyond distinguishing the national majority from national minorities to purifying the nation by expunging it of all minorities. I argue that Nuremberg failed to root out Nazism politically. Unlike the criminal model, which understands violence as the result of antisocial acts of individual perpetrators, I focus on extreme violence as an outcome of collective mobilization against minorities in the nation state. Rather than individualize the violence as a standalone act, I point to cycles of violence sustained by groups mobilized as so many constituencies. Rather than catalog atrocities so as to name, shame, and punish its perpetrators, I seek to identify the issues around which constituencies are mobilized. Rather than exclude perpetrators from the political process, I seek to include them along with all those who survived, victims, perpetrators, beneficiaries, bystanders. I use the term survivor differently from how it was used after the Holocaust or after the Rwandan genocide, not just to refer to surviving victims of extreme violence, but to all those who survived extreme genocide. Let me come to Israel. Are Jewish people in Israel settlers or immigrants? The Jewish population of Mandate Palestine belonged to three groups. There were those who had never left. These were natives. There were those who returned on a pilgrimage seeking a religious homeland. They were content to be part of the existing polity. This was the first aliyah of immigrants. Then there were those who wanted their own exclusive polity, a Jewish nation state in place of the existing polity. They came in the second and third aliyah. These were the settlers. The Zionist striving for a nation state cannot be understood unless we also grasp the lesson they drew from Germany. Victims of the nation state project in Germany and in Europe, Zionists decided to set up a nation state in Eretz Israel. The Zionist state project has unfolded in two phases. The first reduced the Palestinians from a majority to a minority. This was the Nakba. The Zionist project has continued to demonize the minority that remained within its territorial boundaries as a demographic threat, demanding that their numbers be further cut down. In reality, the Nakba never ended. It continues today. Palestinians inside Israel do not participate in sovereignty. They have rights, even political rights, including the right to vote, but they do not participate in power. This vision has become clearer as the state project has been redefined, from Israel as a Jewish and democratic state to Israel as a Jewish state. I have already spelt out the significance of the debate on one state versus two-state solution. One state would be akin to direct racial domination, whereas a two-state solution would create a protectorate and lead to indirect colonialism under Zionist rule. The history of the African slave in America shows that a one-state solution is a better framework for building alliances and broadening the frame and depth of resistance. But to have a future, that resistance needs to look for a third alternative. I propose that we look at the South African transition from apartheid to glimpse the vision of a third alternative. I argue that the anti-apartheid resistance took a creative turn in the 1970s, leading to an epistemological and political breakthrough for the anti-apartheid movement. Before the 1970s, anti-apartheid politics was largely derivative. It reproduced the architecture of apartheid. Each racial group organized separately, as defined by apartheid power. Africans as ANC, Indians as Natal Indian Congress, coloreds as Colored People's Congress, and whites as Congress of Democrats. By reproducing the architecture of apartheid inside the resistance, resistance gave apartheid a natural flavor. The apartheid mindset was broken only in the 1970s. The key initiative came from the student movement, starting when Black students, led by Biko, left the liberal white student organization and formed their own separate body, going on to organize township dwellers, starting with Soweto. Left in the wilderness, radical white students turned to organizing hostile workers on the fringes of townships. Out of this experience was born an epistemological awakening that white and black are political identities, and that political identity is historical, not natural. Black, said Biko, is not a color. If you are oppressed, you are black. There was nothing inevitable about the impact of BC, Black consciousness, on the anti-apartheid struggle. BC could have led to a nation-state consciousness, claiming that South Africa is a black nation of the black majority, thus essentializing black as a trans-historical identity. Instead, it led to an epistemological awakening, the consciousness of black as a historical political identity. Afrikaners made a journey from being junior partners of British colonialism to being part of the anti-apartheid coalition, but there was no consensus. The South African movement was born in the 70s and 80s. There was a threefold shift in vision. From opposition to apartheid, the anti-apartheid movement looked for an alternative to apartheid. Rather than just turning the world upside down, it dared to think of a different world. From a state of the majority, the national majority, the black majority, it looked to create a state of all the people. From opposition to whites, it went on to focus its opposition to white power. The turning point was when anti-apartheid forces reformulated the demand from black majority rule to non-racial rule. Rather than deny the existence of race as phenotypical difference, they refused to endow racial difference with a political significance. The first step to decolonizing the political was deracialization. The next step would be detribalization. Rather than deny the cultural significance of tribe as an ethnic group, detribalization would decouple the link between culture and territory, ethnicity and homeland, citizenship and identity, forged under colonialism. To do so would be to reverse the politicization of culture under apartheid through the creation of homelands, homeland authority, and customary law. The result would be to create a single citizenship, not multiple citizenships based on separate identifications, race in the colonials in the central state and tribe in the homelands. 1994 created formal political equality in South Africa, regardless of race. It has yet to create formal political equality in the former homelands, regardless of tribal identity. My claim is that a successful struggle for social justice will need to cut across the political divide imposed by race and tribe. Without political equality, the mobilization for social justice will be fragmented into so many races and tribes. 1994 was the birth of a new political community. Instead of a rupture into two separate political communities, one of victims of apartheid and another of perpetrators, blacks and whites, which would have required a partition of South Africa. Let us not forget that in 1994, Afrikaners divided, with a minority asking for a homeland where Afrikaners would have their own state. The political community that did emerge in 1994 was that of survivors of apartheid, not just victims who survived, but all survivors, whether victims, perpetrators, beneficiaries, or bystanders. The anti-apartheid struggle was not directed from a single center, but from multiple centers. Not only did the struggle include multiple initiatives, they were sometimes contradictory. Take the example of the anti-apartheid boycott, which was directed from outside the country, and the internal political struggle, which demanded reform of the political process to allow the oppressed majority the right to participate in the political process. Whereas the anti-apartheid boycott made no distinction between South African state and society, calling for a boycott of both, the internal political struggle proceeded by building alliances with all sectors of white society, so long as they did not openly and actively support the apartheid state. Apartheid power was not defeated. Neither did apartheid win. The situation in the mid-1980s could only be described as a stalemate. Why then did apartheid agree to negotiate in 1990? Two considerations made captains of apartheid rethink their primary reliance on a military strategy. One, the possibility that anti-apartheid mobilization may spread from townships to Bantustans. But more important was the second possibility, one that signaled the likelihood of an even more scary outcome. Boers realized that the hitherto pro-apartheid Boer intelligentsia was gradually beginning to abandon apartheid as a state project. The principal critique of 1994 is that there was no social justice. This critique both states a truism and misses the political rebirth that did happen in 1994. I argue that we should see the rebirth as the beginning of a political decolonization, without which the decolonization of society would be far more difficult to achieve. Israel-Palestine. I would like to begin with a note on political Zionism. As the core of political Zionism is the effort to build not just a religious Jewish community in the Holy Land, but a Jewish state. Political Zionism seeks to erase the distinction between state and society. The conflation of society with state is the foundation of the nation state and its program of rule by a permanent national majority. The nation state may call itself a democracy, as Israel does, but this democracy, this majority, is not actually determined through political contestation. Rather, the majority is defined pre-politically, as it is the nation itself. The most the majority can hope for is a democracy for the majority, but not for all. But even majoritarian democracy remains a difficult project in Israel, because the state defines who can be a member of that majority. In other words, who is officially recognized as a Jew. The most fundamental of Israel's unanswered questions is, who is a Jew? If Israel is to be a state for Jews only, it must answer the question of who is a Jew. Its answer cannot avoid flattening the diversity of world Jewry into the Jewry sanctioned by the state. At the legal level, this question has bedeviled Israeli authorities since the law of return was passed in 1950. Is a Jew defined by religion or by ethnicity? Are Jews members of a religious community or a nationality, or both? As a result, the State of Israel now has two legal definitions of who is a Jew. The narrow definition provided by halakha, the religious law, which Israel embraces in the sphere of personal affairs, and the broad definition in the amended law of return. Excuse me. At the political and social level, Judaization eliminates unacceptable forms of Jewishness. The acceptable form is associated with Ashkenazim, who trace their lineage to Yiddish-speaking parts of Europe. Ashkenazim were the founders of the state, who embraced the role of civilizers, committed to bring other Jews into line with the national ideal. In particular, Ashkenazim have sought to civilize Mizrahim. The Mizrahim are the Arab Jews, today the majority of Jews in Israel. They present a special challenge to Zionism, for Zionism presumes that Arab and Jewish identity are both incompatible and indelibly hostile towards one another. Otherwise, there would be no need for a Jewish state in historic Palestine. Ashkenazi Israel has demanded of the Mizrahim that they renounce their Arab culture and only embrace their religion, Judaism. No wonder the Mizrahim have paid back by standing behind a religious Zionism that stands to the right of Ashkenazim, politically sidelining it. For the Mizrahim, there are two political enemies, not only Palestinians, but also Ashkenazi Israel. In the Zionist worldview, Palestinians are Canaanites who never left home. They are squatters, not natives. With the return of the native after the Holocaust, the squatter must get out of the way and make room for the native civilized by 500 years in the West. The Palestinian resistance has led to multiple shifts in the Palestinian liberation movement. From an early focus on armed struggle and following the first and second Intifada, Palestinian mobilization in Israel and the occupied territories has moved to a demand for political change. The goal has been to undo the Jewish state and replace it with a state of all citizens. Israel's political response has been to fragment Palestinians into three disconnected groups: Palestinian citizens of Israel, Palestinians in the occupied territories, and Palestinian refugees. The development of a Palestinian consciousness straddling these three groups has been an outcome of a protracted process whose focus and center of gravity have shifted radically over time, from exile to home, and from an all or nothing demand for Israel's disintegration to a demand for involvement in the Israeli political process. Organizationally, this has involved a threefold transition. At first, displaced Palestinians looked to Arab frontline states to be their protectors and liberators. After these Arab states were defeated in 1967, Palestinians turned to the nascent and exile-led PLO, an armed resistance movement. In 1982, Israel went to war in Lebanon. The brainchild of Ariel Sharon, then the defense minister, the Lebanon War was in fact a total war against the Palestinians. The IDF deployed well over 120,000 troops for over 10 weeks. It was the country's largest mobilization since the 1973 war, according to the historian Rashid Khalidi. Outgunned and overwhelmed, the PLO withdrew to Tunis. But while the PLO was defeated, Sharon's strategic objective remained unrealized. Instead, the war intended to suppress Palestinian resistance only stoked it further. With the exiled armed resistance smashed, the moment was ripe for political mobilization at home. The first Intifada in the late 1980s crystallized the internationalization of Palestinian leadership, crystallized the internalization of Palestinian leadership, and with it, a definitive rejection of the failed armed resistance championed by the external leadership with a mainly refugee base. Arafat made two crucial compromises at Oslo. First, he tacitly accepted settlements in the West Bank. Second, he explicitly accepted Israel's stranglehold over the economy and sovereignty of the occupied territories, even going so far as to agree that this stranglehold would persist in a future Palestinian state. The second Intifada, beginning in 2000, brought together Palestinians in Israel and the occupied territories under a single movement. Both Intifadas responded to the failings of the official PLO. The second, in particular, reflected frustration over the PLO's capitulation to Zionism at the Oslo Accords of 1993 and the onward rush of settlements that followed. The success of the Second Intifada led to mobilization under Balad, the National Democratic Alliance, a political party then led by Azmi Bishara, a Palestinian member of the Knesset. On May 21, 2001, Bishara proposed a new basic law aimed at achieving rights for Palestinians as a national minority. But in the months that followed, Bishara went on to present another bill countering the false claim that Israel is a democratic state. It did so by asking the Knesset to rewrite that assertion in its basic law and instead affirm that Israel is a state of all its citizens. Whereas Bishara's first bill sought equal rights for the national minority, now he was asking the Knesset to reject the idea that Israel is a nation state, a state of the Jewish people, explicitly, thereby negating the existence of both the national minority and the national majority. Over the past decade, Palestinian politics has moved from an engagement predominantly internal to one predominantly external. The internal engagement called for a state of all its citizens as a counter to the Zionist project for a Jewish nation state. The external engagement takes the form of an international boycott of Israeli state and society under BDS. To the extent that BDS calls for the de-Zionization of the State of Israel, there is reason to give it enthusiastic support. But to the extent that BDS seeks to extend this boycott to Israeli society, and not just to its Zionist sectors, there is reason to be critical. BDS needs to learn from the very experience it claims to build on, that is, the South African divestment and boycott during apartheid. The main problem with blanket boycotts is that they embrace a mirror image of the nation-state framework, which collapses state and society into one. By themselves, international boycotts are incomplete. The strategy of isolating the state internationally needs to be aligned with a domestic strategy to win over forces that are either indifferent or opposed to the Zionist state in the ongoing struggle to isolate its supporters. What can BDS learn from the South African experience? First, whereas BDS can contribute to Israel's international isolation, something more is needed if a non-Zionist alternative is to bloom in Israel itself. Like in South Africa, that something else is an epistemic revolution that will open the way to a political one. Phase 2 of the Palestinian moment will come when the same dynamic that leads to the unity of the oppressed also leads to the isolation of the oppressors, when it is not just the oppressed who seek political change, but also many of the current supporters of Zionist power. Getting there will require a new kind of political consciousness within Israel, a consciousness based on the recognition that the flourishing of Jews and Jewish life does not require a Zionist state, that Jews can have a national home in Israel-Palestine, but not a national state. It is this South African lesson that needs to be driven home to Israelis, as many as possible, that Jews do not need to have a Jewish state to have a secure home in Israel-Palestine. The lesson for BDS is that they need to build on the gains made by Balad. To do so would be to provide a political home to all anti-Zionist and even non-Zionist groups, Jews and Palestinians. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Professor, for your remarks and insights. I have tracked down a number of questions I'll be happy to ask you in a little bit. Now, I would like to ask Dr. Sharma to take the floor. Dr. Sharma, you mentioned you wanted to share your screen, correct? There we go. Yes, I can see it. I think you're still mute, Dr. Sharma. If you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, classic
Yeah.
Zoom mistake. Sorry.
Not at all. Not at all. Over to you, please.
Is the PowerPoint the way that it's displayed right now fine?
I see. I actually see your own view, so the presenter's view, but not the audience view, right?
Okay.
So, yeah.
I also only see right now a black screen.
Yeah,
Yeah.
only black. Okay, okay. I think we're on the good track here. Yeah.
Is this fine now then?
Yeah, try and play the presentation. Okay, now,
Yeah.
yes. I see the cover of your book. Exactly.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. So thank you very much to the organizers of the conference, particularly Dr. Naqvi for inviting me. Also to all those whose labor has made this possible, to all the students and the other attendees, and to my co-panelist, Professor Mamdani, whose work has greatly influenced mine, as I'm sure you will shortly see. This talk is largely based on my new book, Home Rule, National Sovereignty and the Separation of Natives and Migrants. And I want to begin actually where Professor Ramaioli began his introduction to this panel, which is that we live in a world whose political organization in no way corresponds with the way we actually live our lives. This is true ecologically, as Professors Frezeau and Veblen made abundantly clear yesterday in their talks. It's true economically. It is also true socially, as is evident in the conference that we are all participating in. While we cannot live without one another, without one another's labor, one another's sociability, everywhere we have a political system of nation states that divides us from each other on the basis of nationality. We have nation states who claim land and air and water as their sovereign territory, who claim people, other animals, and plants as theirs, who claim to have the exclusive power to determine who enters their national space, what status they are given, and how much or little they have to live. Nationality matters. The economist Branko Milanovic has argued that today, almost 3/4 of global inequality is due to one's national citizenship. As such, nationals in the rich world states are provided with what he calls a citizenship rent. Indeed, one's nationality has become the greatest determinant of one's income and wealth. In stark contrast to the situation in the mid-19th century, when much of the inequality between people in the world could be explained by the differences in income between capitalists and workers, today the gap between quote unquote unskilled workers' wages in rich and poor nation states often differs by a factor of 10 to 1. Now, national citizenship matters because nation states across this international system limit the obtainment of citizenship. As Ben Anderson pointed out, the national organization of society is one in which the political community is always imagined as a limited community. Because no nation encompasses all the world's people, nor does it want to, immigration and citizenship controls become crucial technologies for nation making and nation maintaining. They also are key technologies for implementing a global apartheid, which, like the South African apartheid of the mid to late 20th century, is based on nationality. In Home Rule, I talk specifically about the consequences of nation states' control over human mobility. I trace the shifts in how states control people's mobility because while all states attempt to do so, they do not all control people's mobility in the same ways. The ways that imperial states control mobility, for example, differ from how nation states do so. Imperial states were mostly concerned with two things in this regard: bringing people into their imperial territories to work and preventing people captured by their sovereignty from leaving. As states nationalize their sovereignty, a process that began in the 19th century and in the Americas, this changes. Nation states are mostly interested in preventing people. Nation states are mostly not interested in preventing people's exit, but in controlling people's entry. By the 1960s, the national form of state sovereignty had become the dominant form. It is at this point that we can say that a post-colonial New World Order, as I term it, emerged. In this new system of governance, people across the world are defined as parts of separated nations and ruled through the combined apparatuses of nation state sovereignty, international bodies, and globally operative capital. Established after the end of World War II, post-colonialism marks the end of the political legitimacy of imperial state sovereignty and the beginning of the hegemony of national forms of state sovereignty, or the hegemony of national self-determination. After World War II, and with astonishing speed, the near global space of imperialism was mostly nationalized. Between 1945 and 1960 alone, 36 new nation states in Asia and Africa were granted either a restricted autonomy or outright independence from various empires. In the 1960s, the two most powerful imperial states entering World War II, the British and the French, having lost most of their colonies, also moved to nationalize their own sovereignty, or at least the sovereignty of their imperial metropoles. They did so by implementing new immigration controls, restricting the entry of its former colonial subjects. For those colonized people who did not obtain national sovereignty, the demand for it nevertheless defines their struggles. For many who have been identified as Armenians or Kurds, Mohawks or Hawaiians, Palestinians or Kashmiris, their struggles are framed as struggles for national liberation. It is thus clear that in the post-colonial New World Order, being a member of a nation in possession of territorial sovereignty is the thing to be or to become. Only by organizing as a nation can claims to power in this system be heard. This is not an accident. While much attention has been paid to the dominant part played by the United States in the post-World War II system of global governance, what is often ignored is how critical the US was to its emergence. Having nationalized its own sovereignty in the late 19th century with the passing of its first immigration controls, the 1875 Page Act, the United States played a pivotal role in ending imperial rule and establishing the global rule of nation states. Shortly before the end of World War II, the United States insisted on the doctrine of national self-determination as the basis of a restructured global capitalist economy, which it hoped to dominate. After World War I, the United States was able to enshrine the Wilsonian doctrine of self-rule in the League of Nations. At that time, though, this doctrine did not apply to imperial colonies. Empires were willing to reimagine their metropoles as national societies, but they well knew that extending such a status to their colonies would represent a threat. By 1941, however, with metropolitan France under Nazi occupation and the British metropole itself under Nazi bombardment, Britain was desperate for the United States' help in fighting the Axis powers. The United States seized the opportunity to demand a reorganization of the still largely imperial world to its advantage. That year, 1941, President Roosevelt succeeded in getting British Prime Minister Winston Churchill to accept the extension of the Wilsonian doctrine of self-rule to the natives of the British colonies. Their agreement was sealed in the 1941 Atlantic Charter. The Atlantic Charter, of course, was far from an expression of solidarity of the United States with the colonized. Indeed, the United States could not have been less interested in giving up expropriated land, including the lands comprising US national territory. Neither did it have any intention of ending the exploitation of people's labor, nor in creating a world without hierarchies of worth and disparities in wealth, power, and peace. Instead, the United States understood that imperial state monopolies over their colonies prevented capitalists based in the United States from exploiting those territories and the people within them. Empire simply stood in the way of the United States becoming a world hegemon. The basis of US support for expanding the principle of national self-determination to the colonies was the understanding that it would gain from the opening of closed imperial markets for land, labor, and commodities. Such an opening would be achieved by the transformation of both imperial metropoles and colonies into independent sovereign nation states, each enmeshed in an international regime of financial, political, and military ties. The United States, of course, was wildly successful in achieving these goals. The universal principle of self-rule agreed to in the 1941 Atlantic Charter formed the basis for the first major international political institution of post-colonialism, the United Nations. In its 1945 founding charter, the UN enshrined the recognition of the right of national self-determination, or the right to national sovereignty, for those people who could successfully claim to being the people of a place as the bedrock of international law. Hostility to migrants was firmly established in this charter. With its declaration of the right of nations to self-determination, it would not, indeed it could not, account for the rights of all those people who were not a people, i.e. those made into the people out of place. The UN Charter thus stood in stark contrast to how many people actually lived, and certainly in stark contrast to the reality of the immediate post-World War II experience of mass migration that has only increased since that time. Contrary to the rhetoric of national liberation and the fundamentally undemocratic bromides of the United Nations, this world of nation states did not represent a challenge to the social relations of imperialism. Instead of abolishing the practices of expropriation and exploitation most closely associated with imperialism, post-colonialism worked to contain the revolutionary and liberatory demands of decolonization. Nowhere was land returned to direct producers. Nowhere was the exploitation of people's labor abolished. Indeed, the new international system of nation states provided the institutional structures and force of coercive action for more land to be expropriated and for capitalist social relations to expand. Claiming to have liberated people, post-colonialism liberated capital instead. The post-colonial New World Order is thus not only a particular historical period, i.e. the post-World War II era, or a body of scholarship attempting to analyze it. Post-colonialism is the governmentality of the international system of nation states and the equally international system of capitalist social relations. While post-colonialism clearly doesn't work for most of the world's people, the largely melancholic response to the grossly unequal social relations of post-colonialism sustains it nonetheless. Support for nationalism and for nation states remains hegemonic across the political spectrum, as national sovereignty continues to be seen as the last bastion of resistance to quote-unquote foreign incursions. This is the hegemony of post-colonialism, and its power is far from spent. New nations and new nation states form while older ones dissolve, all often violently. New national liberation movements arise to remake the borders of nationalized territory and set different limits to national belonging. In fact, nationalism is hardening and expanding in ever more uncanny ways. This brings me to a discussion of the politics of autochthony. What is autochthony? Derived from the Greek autos, for self, and katon, earth, the term autochthon referred to, quote, an original or indigenous inhabitant of a place. Autochtons were people who had literally said or claimed to have sprung from the earth. The term indigenous is also from classical Greece. To be indigenous was to be born inside, with the class connotation of being born inside the house, inside the master's house. Like autochthon, indigenous denoted someone or something born or produced naturally in a land or region, native or belonging naturally to the soil, region, etc., according to the OED. Because the politics of autochthony are relational, autochtons can only be understood in relation to their others. The counterpart to autochtons or indigenous people are the allochtons, predicated on the Greek allo, to that, referring to that which is other or different, and the Indo-European allo, referring to someone or something else, and first used as a geological reference. Allochthonous refers to something from some place other than where it is currently found. It was not until the mid-19th century that things and later people were defined as allochtons. Autochthonous discourses restrict political membership to those who can show that they are native to the polity. Arguably, autochthonous discourses define national forms of state membership with their ideas of the sovereignty of the nation over the state and over its territory. Thus, even though the state category of native, which marked the status of colonial subjects, was thought to have disappeared as colonized natives became independent nationals, it is clear that embedded in each idea of national sovereignty or home rule is the notion that true nationals are those who are native of its territories. These are the national natives. By restricting the making of claims to sovereignty, territory, and rights to those who are national natives, discourses of autochthony produce borders that are even more fortified and difficult to cross than those between national and migrant. While it is conceivable that one could become a national citizen, it is extremely difficult, if not impossible, to become native. This is because defining any individual as indigenous is based not on where that person is born, but upon the birthplace of their quote unquote race. Political membership predicated on autochthony thus manifests racialized ideas of essentialist origins in territorialized form. Just as nationality matters in a world of nation states, placing people into separated categories of national natives and migrant others is no trifling matter. Across the world system of nation states, a further contraction of the already limited criteria of national belonging has been taking place around the figure of the national native. At the same time, an expansion of the term colonizer has occurred, one that encompasses all those seen to be migrants. Borrowing the imperial meaning of natives as the colonized, those who see themselves as national natives also see themselves as having been colonized by migrants. In turn, migrants' own experience of colonization is deemed to be unpolitical. Today, national autochthony is increasingly important to nationalist projects, both from below and from above. The legal and/or social separation of national natives and migrants animates deadly conflicts around the world. A particularly stark example of this is taking place in Burma or Myanmar, where the discourse of autochthony is the normalizing frame for what has been termed the world's most recent genocide, this time against Rohingya people. Nation-state officials and popular Buddhist monks categorize mostly Muslim Rohingya as quote-unquote illegal Bengali migrants and argue that expelling them from both the nation and its sovereign territory is necessary for the defense of national society. In turn, those who are promoting an autochthonous discourse refer to themselves as the natives of Burma. For instance, the powerful Buddhist monk Ashin Wiratu, the current leader of the violently Islamophobic 969 movement, states that it is simply impossible for, quote, native Burmese to live with Muslim migrants. Over the past 4 decades, Rohingya people have had their homes and property destroyed. They have been tortured, killed, and placed in camps. Their citizenship has been removed, and about 1 million have been forced to flee Burma. Having already been socially constituted as migrants, many have been made into migrants, both in national law and in everyday life. We also see the expulsion of certain people from the category of national by redefining them as not indigenous in today's India. Hindu nationalism, a powerful political force in British India since at least the 1920s, informs criteria for belonging to the Indian nation now more than ever. Since the 1980s, Hindutva has become a powerful electoral movement, as well as one that has fundamentally shaped ideas of national belonging. According to Chetan Bhatt, the BJP's, quote, Hindu nationalism is based on the claim that it is an indigenous product of the primordial and authentic ethnic and religious traditions of India, unquote. The BJP separates the Indian nation state's polity into two groups: national natives, comprised primarily of Hindus, but also for now, Buddhists, Jains, and Sikhs, who are distinguished from the followers of so-called foreign religions, including Muslims, Christians, Jews, and Parsis. For Hindutva supporters, Muslims are especially targeted. This is evident in Prime Minister Modi's growing rhetoric on illegal Muslim migrants, and of course, India's new Citizenship Amendment Act. There are many other stark examples in what have been termed the national liberation states, some of which Professor Mamdani has brilliantly analyzed and recounted. For example, the deadly conflicts between supposed natives and supposed migrants in Darfur and in Rwanda. We also have the Yugoslav wars, the military coups d'etats of Asian parliamentary leaders in Fiji from the 1980s to the 2000s, the expulsion of quote unquote Asians from indigenizing Uganda in 1972. In addition, we have moral panics over migrant invasions of Europe and other nation states where a growing number of people are uncannily claiming the mantle of indigeneity for themselves. As one right-wing blogger in Norway put it, quote, "Why is colonialism bad except when my country, which has no colonial history, gets colonized by third world people," unquote. This kind of rhetoric has also spurred violence and provided the foundation for a growing authoritarianism. Moreover, the distinction that Professor Mamdani makes in his new book between settler and immigrant has completely collapsed in contemporary indigenous politics in the former white settler colonies. Increasingly, in indigenous national movements here, every non-native has been redefined as a settler colonist, including, most egregiously, those groups who were expressly excluded from the white settler colonial project: Black people, Latinx people, and Asian people. In the process, the very act of moving has been turned into an act of colonization, further shoring up the autochthonous view of the world. All of these represent a hardening of nationalisms, hardening around the idea of autochthony. While these many different instances of autochthonous nationalisms are not equivalent to one another, there are, however, important similarities in the different uses of autochthonous discourses, and these are not merely semantic. All autochthonous discourses portray nativeness as an essential, unpolitical characteristic of some people, and portray autochthony as the only legitimate basis for political power. The deployment of autochthonous discourses thus reveals a crucial feature of post-colonial power. All nationalisms are fundamentally autochthonous and productive of a hierarchical separation between national natives, autochtons, and migrants, allochtons. Across the world and across the political spectrum, the right of national natives to home rule is evident. In the process, migrants are left without a home in this world. The separation of natives and migrants is, I argue, both a legacy of imperialism and constitutive of the hegemony of the post-colonial New World Order. This brings me to my final point: decolonization. To start, we need to recognize that the very terms of decolonization have been co-opted. The fact that the very practices denounced as imperialism, expropriation of land, exploitation of labor, oppression of the colonized, continue unimpeded in every nationally sovereign state is the truth that is rarely spoken to post-colonial power. Instead, ongoing, indeed intensifying disparities are largely explained in two main ways, as either being caused by neo-colonialism or by the existence of migrants in national native territories. Both work as alibis for the obvious failures of nation states to ensure the conditions for people to thrive. This is perhaps nowhere more evident than in the national liberation states, many of which are now 70 years old or more. Here, the discourse of neo-colonialism is readily deployed to explain why the promises of decolonization have not been fulfilled and why they are receding ever further from view. In offering a refuge for nationalists, discourses of neo-colonialism keep the project of national independence alive. Indeed, claiming to be fighting colonialism, neo or otherwise, is the governmentality of the post-colonial New World Order. The continuing significance of movements for national self-determination, both in extant nation states and in movements for new national sovereigns, has left us with an understanding of colonialism as being nothing more than foreign rule. Consequently, decolonization has become nothing more than home rule, the elevation of national natives over migrants. The result has been a hardening of nationalisms and a resultant increase in anti-immigrant politics. Indeed, anti-colonialism has been redefined as anti-immigration, and contenders for political power in rich and poor world nation states bemoan their lack of national independence. Yet the nation state is structurally incapable of delivering on the promises of decolonization. This is not because it does not have enough national sovereignty, but because of the global arena in which capitalism operates and because of the relationship between ruling classes and state power. This is glaringly so with regard to national citizenship and immigration controls, which have from the start been a response to crises in capitalism. From the first controls against the free movement of quote unquote coolie workers in the British Empire in the early 19th century, to the reorganization of the global political order into a world of nation states, citizenship and immigration controls have done two main things. One, provide flexibility and relatively cheaper labor power by classifying some workers as migrants in national labor markets. And secondly, to politically separate workers within what is in reality a world market for labor power. Anti-immigrant politics actually create more competition within labor markets that have been nationalized through citizenship and immigration controls. More nationalism leads to more anti-immigration politics, which leads to the further cheapening of the labor of migrants, which leads to more competition, which leads to ever more nationalism, more competition, and more cheapened migrants ad infinitum. While portrayed as benefiting citizens because it elevates them above migrants, citizenship and immigration controls in reality harm all workers. To acknowledge this is to acknowledge the failure of nation states. To avoid addressing this reality, nation states endlessly replay the fight against colonialism. For this positions them as the defenders of the nation rather than the managers of ruling relations. This is why new colonizers have to constantly be produced and why migrants, the quintessential people out of place, are represented as colonizers invading native nations. Now, how do we get from this sorry state of affairs to a decolonized world? A crucial first step toward decolonization, I believe, is the dismantling of the borders, including the borders of identity erected between people categorized as either national natives or as migrants. We must rebuild our solidarity, not just across, but more importantly, against the nations and the nation states who depend on these categories for their existence. This is not possible without also dismantling barriers to people's free mobility. But what would a world without nations, without borders, without racisms, without people being separately categorized as either national natives or migrants, without states look like? Some say that a world beyond post-colonialism simply looks like a more inclusive nation state. The thinking goes, since national citizenship is a category that grants people rights, let's move migrants into the category of national. There are two problems with this approach. First, national societies are always closed. They're always limited. Although they might be open or closed to different categories of people at different times, any expansion of national citizenship will hit one limit or another. This is because the existence of immigration controls define national sovereignty. Together, national limits to citizenship and to free mobility is what allows nation states to be nation states. Second, the idea that making migrants into citizens resolves the fact of subordination and exploitation assumes that citizens are neither oppressed nor exploited, thus reproducing the quintessential nationalist myth that the bonds of nationhood transcend class. They do not. No nation state is structurally able to counteract the very real limits to equality set by global capitalism. These obvious limits might then lead some to say that what we need is a post-national state. That is, a state that merely administers its territory without setting any boundaries of state belonging. A state that merely acts as a system of redistribution and protection without demanding adherence to one or another form of identity. Yet, states are much more than administrative institutions. Historically, states emerge when a ruling class is formed. In the process, land is turned into territory. The alienation of land is the basis for people's labor to be exploited. This is an aspect of each and every form of state power, not just national. It's the form of state power of monastic states, monarchical states, imperial states, as well as nation states. This is to say that a world without borders, without racism, without people being separated into categories of natives or migrants is not a matter of making a slight administrative fix. It would create a new world. Current efforts to build such a world would not be the first. Since the world's first sovereigns, about 5,000 years ago, people captured by states have demonstrated a vast practice of what James Scott has called the art of not being governed. If we redefine colonialism as the theft of our commons, decolonization comes to be about the struggle for our planetary commons. The right that is held by every commoner is the right to not be excluded. In this regard, there is an integral relationship between freedom and mobility. This is what distinguishes common property from private property, where the title holder has the right to exclude others, or from sovereign rights, where the sovereign has the right to exclude people from membership in the political community. Unlike natives or nationals, commoners seek neither territory nor sovereignty, but land and the ability to enjoy a livelihood on it without exclusion. The politics of the commons, I would contend, is a reparative politics. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Sharma, for your insightful remarks here. Nauman, if you are okay, I may offer a couple of quick questions to our guest, and then I'll leave it to you, okay? Dr. Sharma, Dr. Mamdani, again, thank you so very much. I had a large number of questions. I'll limit myself to not more than one or two. First of all, you're really challenging us, the audience, but also the existing political system, basically, to think outside the current parameters. And while, of course, I want to be optimistic, do you see ways in which some sort of transformative politics may actually take place here? Meaning that even thinking, for example, about a non-Zionist Jewish state is difficult for anybody who has any familiarity with the situation in Palestine. Thinking in terms of a non-nation state planet without borders, it's something that requires, I don't want to say a leap of faith, but incredible fantasy and creativity. So I don't know which kind of openings do you see to bring about such, to use the word of Dr. Mamdani, a epistemological shift. We have to start thinking about stuff in a different way in order to change reality. So that's a very broad general question that I had for both of you. if I may also ask a specific question, a little more empirical to both of you. First of all, Dr. Mamdani, if you could tell me what, in your opinion, made the South African experience different from other cases in the 20th century. South Africa, indeed, in your book, comes out as one of those, inspirational examples that may chart a new path. And what made South Africa different from other countries, other former colonies that underwent a dramatic transformation, not as emancipatory as in South Africa? And to Dr. Sharma, I would like instead to ask, do you see indeed a encroachment of the idea of the autochthon? I mean, we have been living in a world where people were trumpeting the end of nation states, the globalized world where everybody will be transcending nation states, and yet you're making quite the opposite remark instead. You're saying, no, look at what's going on in the world. We are not moving in that direction. If anything, at least the idea, the concept, the logic of the nation, the state, how they're coupled together in this idea of the autochthon seems to be even more pressing and powerful than in the past. So I would like perhaps Professor Mamdani to answer first, and then we may go to Dr. Sharma. Professor Mamdani, over to you, please.
Sorry, thank you. Thank you very much. I was busy unmuting myself and whatever the word is, getting myself on the screen. What makes the South African experiences different? I think nationalists have thought of political decolonization as independence from the outside. And in thinking in this manner, they have tended to assume the inside. They've tended to naturalize the inside, see the inside as ahistorical, see the problem as purely external. What they have failed to understand is the learning experience that colonialism went through. In my understanding, by mid-19th century, especially the British, realized that the colonial project is simply a project of the domination of the inside from the outside would not be durable. This became clear with a string of crises: 1857 India, 1860s West Indies, 1890s Sudan, the Mahdiya. There was a wide-ranging discussion in Britain on what to do. I think the most far-sighted view was of Henry Maine, who was a legal member of the Viceroy's Commission in India. And Maine argued that the 1857 uprising was the result of an epistemic defect. And he said the British had to drop their hubris. They had, first of all, to understand the subjectivity of those they colonized. And through understanding this, to try and identify every difference in that subjectivity. And then decide which difference needed to be politicized in order to differentiate and fragment the inside. This fragmentation took place along lines of political identities, each of which politicized culture in a particular way, whether race or religion or tribe, and so on. In South Africa, this epistemically rethought counterinsurgent strategy was a response to the development of a powerful movement of migrant labor, the ICU in 1920s. The realization that capitalist exploitation and capitalist dispossession was creating a massive movement of peasants to the cities. It was what Marx had called primitive accumulation. Apartheid was the final step in the antidote, which was a political antidote. This political antidote cannot just be understood as the political expression of the dominance of apartheid, the dominance of capital, but has to be understood as providing us an insight into the creativity of the political itself. And the object of this onslaught was to fragment the inside, was to preclude the possibility of this excluded mass gaining a different identity of itself as an excluded mass. Well, what was different about the South African struggle is, first of all, the realization, and I think that realization only begins in the 1970s, the realization that they had to think of the political community created inside South Africa by colonialism, including in its apartheid phase. And they had first to wage a struggle to denaturalize these boundaries. I've argued that these boundaries are of race and tribe. I've also argued that they had some success with depoliticizing race, but not depoliticizing tribe. As a result, if you see the violence in South Africa since 1994, what is known as xenophobic violence, this violence is mainly aimed not at the racial stranger, but at the tribal stranger. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mamdani. Dr. Sharma, over to you, please.
So I think you had asked whether, like, the relationship between processes of globalization and the continuing power of the nation state.
Yeah, it seemed to me that your claims went against some of the discourses you hear about the eventual weakening of nation states in light of globalization tendencies, stuff like that. And of course, in the last few years, as you pointed out, we've seen a rise in a certain kind of managing politics that seem to go pretty much in the opposite direction. And coming from Europe, I mean, the whole, frenzy about migration from the Middle East lately and stuff like that, right? So I could see it firsthand. And you seem you picked up in your framework this specific moment, right?
Yeah. Well, having been a migrant myself a couple of times in my life, having been a migrant from India to Canada at the early stages of what we call this latest period of globalization, the late 1960s, I can testify that this kind of anti-immigrant politics is not new,
Right.
that it's inherent to the national form of state power, I would argue. But secondly, I think those accounts of globalization that argue that somehow corporations, multinationals, transnational corporations are somehow diminishing the power of nation states are not recognizing how integral nation states are to the regulation and management of capital relationships themselves, right? They seem to posit some kind of antagonism between capital and nation states, which I don't think has ever existed. And in fact, the example that I gave of the 1941 Atlantic Charter that Roosevelt forced Churchill to sign while Churchill was over a bit of a barrel, demonstrates actually that the achievement of national sovereignty was seen by certain parts of capital to be quite beneficial to it. So I think like that's what I'm trying to get at with the concept of the post-colonial New World Order, right? That the post-colonialism is about the national regulation of an expanding capital. And capital is in more people's lives, in more places in the world, in more parts of people's lives than it ever has been before.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sharma. I've been reminded we are already a little bit over time, but Nauman, we can go on a little bit longer if our guests do not mind. Nauman, over to you. If you have any remarks or questions to offer, please.
Yeah, given time is short, I'd like to make some brief remarks. What an outstanding panel. Thank you so much for those just excellent, scintillating insights. I'm getting ecstatic comments from various people about what a great panel this is. I'd like to say, first of all, I'd like to mark the fact that today is March 23rd. Here in Pakistan, it's celebrated, it's a holiday here today. It's celebrated as the Pakistan Resolution Day. So this is in reference to the Lahore Resolution of 1940, which didn't mention the word Pakistan and was not passed on the 23rd of March. So that tells you something about these fictional histories that nations create. But I want to mark the fact that this was, of course, a two-state solution. Yeah, what the 1940 resolution of the All India Muslim League in Lahore did do was mark in stone the idea that Hindus and Muslims, of course, the idea had been around earlier. 1923 is when Hindutva comes into existence. The idea of Pakistan is 1933, exactly 10 years later. 1933, of course, also reminds us of other historical events happening around the time. And of course, these were resonating across the planet. Yeah. So once again, that global sense we have. So it did, and it was explicitly referred, Jinnah explicitly referred that the problem between Hindus and Muslims is an international, this is how you put it, international problem. Yeah. So I wanted to start by marking that. And then I also wanted to say about, at the very beginning of his talk, Mahmood was saying that he was pleasantly surprised that his work speaks to this to this panel and to this conference, to the idea of a reparative future. I think both of your visions are actually exactly the kind of reparative visions that we need. I wanted to say something about, so one of the things that we do over here is teach a course called Hikmah, which is the history of Islamic thought. And in that, from Shahab Ahmed's marvelous book, What is Islam? He recounts what politics was about actually in the pre-modern period, which we've largely forgotten. So in the Muslim context, in the pre-modern Muslim context, the purpose of politics, so Nasiruddin Tusi, a very important text about the virtuous city, he says that the purpose, and this is by no means unique to him, the purpose of government was maslahat, which is actually comes from Salaha, Sulah. Yes, so when you hear about Akbar Sulle Kul, that's not unique to Akbar, this idea of absolute peace between different communities. Yeah, the purpose of government, which was also, of course, called hukumat and had to do with hikmah, which means wisdom. Yeah, so wisdom and government were inextricably intertwined, and the purpose of government was to bring about the general welfare, but also Maslahat has this context of reparation, yeah, repairing. So the purpose of government, the purpose of statecraft is actually repairing relations, and actually the word that he uses is creating love between different communities. So this is very much this reconciliatory and reparative vision that both of you in your different ways have put forward is very much the kind of reparative kind of government that we need. And we don't have the time. I mean, I have no problem going on. If you'll allow, I'll ask you one question, Nandita, about this melancholic response, yeah, that you were gesturing towards, that you were saying that in fact the response has been overwhelmingly melancholic. You know, lots of people, what else are they supposed to do except be melancholic, given the kind of situation in which they find themselves? And, you know, it's, you know, if you think of the blues, for instance, and similar forms, yeah, I mean, this kind of udasi is what we would call it, you know, in Hindi and in Urdu. This is very much part of the existential condition, you would say, of many people who are excluded precisely in the ways that you have been talking about. So, so I wanted to ask you about that. And I also, of course, I want to ask Mahmood, you know, this two-state, so I have this problem also. I've asked you this question before, but for the purposes of this panel, I'd like to ask you again. Can we, even a one-state solution, yeah, even if it is a one-state solution, it would, for in our region, in this region of South Asia, a one-state solution would obviously not be within the current states as they exist in this region. Yeah, but I think Nandita was also gesturing towards this. Don't we need some other form apart from whether it's a nation state or not, apart from the state form, yeah, territorial state form, and what would that look like? Thank you. Thank you again for those wonderful papers.
So in terms of melancholia, I agree with you that, you know, so much of our response to this world is melancholic. But I do think that, you know, although Freud was wrong on so much, I do agree with Freud that there is a distinction, and an important distinction, between melancholia and grief. And I do think that grief is a potentially revolutionary response, whereas melancholia keeps you in the state that is causing those reactions. So melancholia, for instance, I would say that the theory of neocolonialism is a melancholic theory, right? Because it presupposes that we just haven't gotten rid of enough foreigners. The foreigners are still running our economy, you know, our politics, you know, et cetera, et cetera. Instead of actually recognizing and grieving the actual fact that the way that the entire global system is operated is uneven, is unequal, right? So contrary to the rhetoric of sovereignty as somehow, you know, a collection of co-sovereigns, you know, there is no equality built into this system. Of course, there's going to be some sovereigns who are more powerful than other sovereigns. And on top of all sovereigns, you have finance. And, you know, it's like, you have, the struggle to gain access to financial capital. So grieving for me would be to acknowledge once and for all that the national liberation project has failed. That is not a route out of colonization. It's not a route out of expropriation, out of exploitation. And if we could just acknowledge that and just say, okay, this was, my grandparents were both very active in the anti-British, anti-colonial struggle. And I know that they didn't feel that it was going to be lost when they were fighting for it, but they soon came to see that the dreams of decolonization never were fulfilled by the Indian nation state. So when are we going to grieve that and say, okay, enough, we've had enough of this, we need a different project? And I think that's the difference between melancholia and grief.
Nauman, shall I go ahead and answer
Yes,
your question?
please, yes.
Of course, you're right, that the story does not end with one state or two-state solution. All I claim is that one state provides a beginning for further steps. And that further step is to rethink the very nature of this one state. I talk in the book about decoupling nation from state. And it raises interesting problems of political belonging, which Namrita has talked about. But first, I need to give a caveat. I am not trying to provide a blueprint. Okay, I don't think that whatever we would call a South African solution can be applied to other places. Because I think comparative framework requires acknowledging not only similarities, but also differences. So all one example can do for us is to provide illumination on other examples, not a solution. Now, the illumination for me is decoupling the nation and the state. That means to me, and I don't say this in the book, but after giving several book talks, I realized that what I should have said in the book is that we need to rethink the very notion of citizenship, not the definition of citizenship, that citizenship itself as a concept. Because I think citizenship as a concept is tied to the notion of the nation state. And I think that in this new form of the state, it is not the citizen who should have, who should be the bearer of rights, but it's the inhabitant, every inhabitant of the territory. And I'll just give a South African example. In 1994, when the what are known as the first non-apartheid elections took place, one of the big questions was who should have the right to vote? And there were two positions. One was citizens. The other was echoing the 1955 Freedom Charter of ANC. South Africa belongs to all those who live in it. Not citizens, but inhabitants. At stake was the franchise of migrant labor. So prominent, so important in South Africa. Labor from Lesotho, from Malawi, from Mozambique, from Zimbabwe, different places. Of course, migrant labor had been central to the formation of the massive trade union in 1970s, FOSATU, but also was very important in the formation of COSATU a decade later. And the option which won out was that the right to vote belongs to every inhabitant of South Africa, not citizen. The dynamic we have seen since 1974 is the reduction, the narrowing of that scope from inhabitant, or you may say resident, to citizen. In the dispensation 1994, Inkatha Freedom Party, a sort of ethnic party in KwaZulu-Natal, took hold of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, and Chief Gatsha Buthelezi became the Minister of Internal Affairs. And from then on, a whole series of administrative regulations, which step by step, chip by chip, disenfranchised non-citizens, migrants. Now, that's an illustration. But all I can say is, at this point, decoupling the nation from the state. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those responses. There's so much to talk about, but we've already gone 20 minutes over. So over to you, Massimo.
Thank you, Nauman. Thank you so much to our esteemed guests. I do hope, Nauman, that a lot of our students have been attending this session. Our is a small college for that focuses on teaching, and I hope that our students got at least a little bit of the inspiration I'm sure myself and Nauman got over this talk with both of you. It's been incredibly rewarding, incredibly insightful. I cannot but thank you again so very much. Let's hope that in the future COVID will allow us to host you to host you here at Habib in person. Whenever you drop by Karachi, it would be our pleasure to have you here. And again, I would like to thank you, Dr. Sharma and Dr. Mamdani, for their generous time, their wonderful remarks and insights. And Khuda Hafiz, and goodbye to everybody. Again, thank you so very much.
May I just say one thing?
Please, Doctor.
To Nandita or Dr. Sharma, which is that first thing I'm going to do tomorrow is to buy your book. I mean, I hadn't heard about it. So I mean, this is a mea culpa, right? So, but I'm going to get the book. I'm dying to read it. Thank you so much.
Well, I have your new book, and I am reading it, and I'm very, very thrilled to be engaging with it. So thank you for it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor. Thank you so much, Nauman. And I'll see you soon tomorrow, hopefully, to the next session of our conference. Thank you guys very much. Khuda Hafiz. Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you, Mahmood. Thank you, Nandita.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.